So today, in fact, we are going to be focusing on Environmental Science Unit 1, specifically referring to Module 1, Ecology. All right, this is lesson number 1. On this particular video, I'll be focusing upon a summarized version as to what we spoke about in class. So the question is, what is ecology? And by definition, ecology is in fact the study of the distribution of organisms basically throughout the environment, referring to the various spheres. And it has to do with the extent to which organisms interact with the environment. And we are referring to the biosphere. Now, the biosphere is in fact one of the many spheres that actually exist within the Earth. Now, the various spheres include the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, lithosphere, and of course the biosphere. Let's go through them very quickly. Now, the atmosphere is in fact layered into different sections. We must bear in mind the one which is closest to the Earth's surface is the troposphere, followed quickly by the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and also the thermosphere. The exosphere is actually that area which is essentially space. So let's go through quickly. I want to highlight basically the characteristics associated with each of these specific spheres, referring to the troposphere all the way down to the thermosphere. The troposphere is in fact that region where all weather exists. There is in fact a lot of pollution, particulate matter, greenhouse gases, and all of these contribute to the warmth to that region relatively close to the Earth's surface. The stratosphere contains the ozone layer. And ultraviolet radiation is in fact filtered out, referring specifically to UVB, an estimated 30 to 70%, and UVC 100% is in fact filtered out by the ozone layer. Alright, the mesosphere contains no particulate matter and basically no greenhouse gases, hence temperatures are in fact very, very low. And the thermosphere contains atomic oxygen, where anything entering the Earth's atmosphere can basically be combusted. Now we must bear in mind, if anything is coming through the Earth's atmosphere from space, it will be combusted through, well, to an extent, as it passes through the thermosphere. It can be super cooled or frozen as it passes through the mesosphere. It can also be heated up again as it passes through the stratosphere, and by extension, it passes through the troposphere and then to the surface of the Earth. Now, we should bear in mind that the layered sections of the atmosphere protects the Earth's surfaces, or else we would have actually had major craters every so often, just like the moon. All right, this atmosphere is one of the major components which help to ensure, to a large extent, that life is allowed to be continued within the environment of the Earth. It is a very essential protective region. Now, the hydrosphere is also very, very, very important, as a matter of fact. Hydro refers to water. This particular sphere has to do with moisture or water that exists within the environment, within the Earth's atmosphere, or even within the Earth's surface or in the subsurface regions. Now, bear this in mind. That region A is associated with the atmosphere where cloud cover exists, which will harbor moisture, all right, and eventually this moisture accumulates and falls in the form of rain. Rain will actually fall on the surfaces of the land, all right, where it simply trickles down and moves to the lower sections of the land. Now, B is in fact associated with moisture that exists on trees, the foliage, the leaves. Remember, the leaves of trees help to intercept moisture primarily through rainfall. That is very important. All right. That is one of the reasons why, if you are in the Amazon rainforest, you will tend to realize rain can actually be falling very heavily, and all of a sudden, maybe about 5 or maybe 10 minutes after, then you might actually feel the raindrops coming down because of the dense foliage or vegetative structure. The leaf density helps to cushion or reduce the impact of the raindrops to the low-lying regions. C is in fact associated with the sea or oceans. All right, D is essentially a lake, all right, or perhaps ponds. Now, all of these are associated with water. Now, bear in mind something for me. Water can actually exist on the surface of the land or even within soils. Water can actually exist on the surfaces of vegetation. Water can actually exist in the atmosphere. All right, so you can actually see, you can get an appreciation how some of these spheres are very much linked. Moving quickly into the lithosphere. The lithosphere essentially conceptualizes that region of the land which is made up of crustal structures, which can either be subcategorized into the continental crust as well as the oceanic crust. These are made up of rigid rock structures. Now, as we saw earlier, right, rainfall or moisture influenced within the hydrosphere can tend to break down the surface rock structures, contributing to sedimentary deposits, which can include sand. It can also include silt, clays, fine particulates, you name it. But generally speaking, the lithosphere is associated with that surface of the land, which is associated with rock structures or rigid structures, some of which can be broken down. We also have the biosphere. Now, the biosphere is in fact that particular region where all spheres somewhat correlate, where all living things may tend to exist. I'm going to say that again. The biosphere is that sphere or that region of the earth where living things exist. And they can actually encompass part and parcel of the lithosphere, the atmosphere, or even the hydrosphere. Take, for instance, the hydrosphere. We have a lot of aquatic or even marine organisms living in the lakes, ponds, the rivers, the streams, the oceans. Think about the atmosphere. We have organisms living there. Simple as bacteria floating in the mid-air that we cannot see. Simple as birds flying. We require oxygen. We are actually part and parcel of those organisms which depend upon the atmosphere for survival, because that is where we actually get our oxygen from, our air to breathe. What about the lithosphere? We have edaphic organisms, which are in fact soil bearing or organisms which exist within the subsurface regions. They tend to essentially dig and burrow into the ground. We are talking about earthworms, ants, bugs, critters, you name it. Even the vegetation or trees at some point will depend upon the lithosphere for anchoring their roots into the essential soils and also within the fractures of rocks. What are necessary for the interaction of organisms with their environment? We have, we know for sure, as you can see in the image here, abiotic factors and biotic factors. Now, abiotic factors essentially conceptualize non-living things, while biotic factors are associated with living things. Now, abiotic factors are very important. As a matter of fact, in the absence of abiotic factors, biotic components would technically cease to exist. Examples of abiotic factors or non-living things include water, minerals, soils, rocks, climate, topography, geographic settings, you name it. Let us evaluate these for a minute. Folks, can we, at some point, is the water alive? The answer is no. But in the absence of water, life cannot exist. Minerals. Are minerals alive? No. But in the absence of minerals, perhaps plants cannot even photosynthesize. In the absence of minerals or trace components as such, our bodily functions can be somewhat affected. We actually get minerals from the decomposition of rocks, all right, by water and many other medium. In the absence of soils, now we don't immediately need soils to survive, but indirectly we do. Because if we did not have any soils, of course, there would not be any medium for root development by trees or plants, much of which we depend heavily for our basic survival and food acquisition. Remember, if there are in fact no living things, such as plants, humans would not be able to derive their proteins directly or indirectly, animals as well. Consumers will essentially die. We get soils from the decomposition of organic material. We get soils also from the breakdown of rocks, from the degradation of the lithosphere, from the breakdown of rocks, okay? Now, rocks are essentially non-living. They are abiotic factors. But the thing about it is that rocks can be displayed on the landmass along different topography or slope angles. So I'm kind of bridging rocks to that of topography or slope. Topography, sorry, refers to the angle of the land, the slope angle. Rocks can be displayed various degree along different slopes, and it actually provides a different geographic setting. Because when you have differences in elevation of rocks, as you can see, for instance, in the previous image, all right, like this here, we have elevated mountain peaks and stuff like that. If you have rocks which are arranged differently as such, obviously the elevation would be different. Organisms can actually adapt to differences in the environment. In addition to which, altitude can influence the microclimate. The higher you go within the troposphere, all right, or from the surface of the earth as you ascend along the landscapes, you realize that the temperature diminishes, the temperature declines rather. So the microclimate can be greatly influenced by the arrangement, the altitude, and the geographic setting of rocks, as well as the topography. Keep that in mind for me, please. Now, abiotic factors. Let's look at this particular image for a minute. This is like a little screenshot I got. Now, these abiotic components, as you listed here, we are seeing soils on the right hand side, the left hand side. We are seeing water. We are seeing landscape at the back, and we are also seeing a house. Now, let's go through this for a minute. The absence of the abiotic factors, living things would cease to exist. Let us discuss this for a minute, right? Now, in the absence of soils, you would not have a medium for microorganisms or even macroorganisms. For example, those soil-bearing organisms, which are considered to be edaphic organisms, you wouldn't have these organisms existing. You would not have any medium for root development. There would essentially be little, perhaps even no, trees or vegetative structures. The density would be limited. If there is the absence of plant productivity, there is also the absence of overall life. Don't expect to have plant productivity being great, especially in the absence of the platform or the substrates, which are essentially soils. In the absence of water, living things cannot survive. They will obviously die. Water is one of the most essential components on the face of the earth. In the absence of landscapes and differences in topography, the land would be monotonous. It will be essentially flat throughout. There will be differences in altitude. There would in fact be differences in processes because mountains act as barriers. Hillsides or elevated slopes also influences wind patterns and stuff like that, which by extension influences the nutrient cycling and also transfers, moisture, and even energy distribution. Look at the home, for instance. They try to inculcate something here by pointing the home as an abiotic component. That essentially conceptualizes shelter. If we don't have shelter, obviously we will be exposed to the elements. Now, the shelter for many edaphic organisms will be the soil. The shelter for many aquatic organisms or marine organisms would be the water. Those ponds, those lakes, oceans, and stuff like that. Our shelter, our abode, is essentially our homes. So technically what they are trying to say here, the abiotic components act as the platforms to which life is hinged upon. In the absence of abiotic components, biotic components would cease to exist. Imagine this for a minute. In the absence of the earth, referring to the raw earth, the rock structure, the water and stuff like that, where would we be? We would be nowhere. We would simply be adrift. We would not even be existing in space. Imagine for a minute the earth is present and it just simply disappears. The actual physical structure of the earth. We will just simply be adrift in space and we'll obviously die. Right? Temperatures would be too cold in space, of course. We would have no means of acquiring food. We will literally starve to death. The temperatures will be extremely cold. We will freeze to death. There will be no gravity. Oxygen will be lacking, and we will simply die. We understand that the biotic factors can be associated with both plant and animals, referring specifically to the kingdoms, the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom generally. And they can also refer to both macro and microorganisms, that is for animals, as well as plants as well. Now, Always bear in mind, we must bear in mind, as a matter of fact, that the ecology, the concept of ecology, as a matter every single subject, we must have strong definitions, basis. Now let's begin with species. Now, by definition, what is a species? Now, this is in fact a very important point, a very important term. Now, bear this in mind. Look at the image for me. You're actually seeing a little, I forget the name of this animal in the top right and left hand corner. Well, let us assume it's a rat. All right. I just really cannot remember the name. Let us assume so, right? We are seeing a T-Rex on the top right hand corner. We are seeing a massive mosquito at the bottom there. We are seeing a polar bear middle, and we are also seeing a lionfish. Now, folks, evaluate this for a minute. Now, let us hope and pray we don't ever see mosquitoes that huge. Let us evaluate this particular image for a minute, right? All of them are different characteristically, referring to physiological characteristics as well as physical characteristics. I'm sure they will have differences in behavioral characteristics as well. For example, a lionfish at the bottom will be swimming in its marine environment. Yes, we know polar bears can swim, but they cannot live exclusively in the water. You wouldn't see a mosquito going for a swim class. That wouldn't happen. You would not see a polar bear flying like a mosquito, nor would a T-Rex be flying like the mosquito even, or a rat for that matter. So all of them are different. Look at the differences in shape. Look at the differences in their physiology. Now, by definition, the term species refer to any organisms or perhaps a group of organisms which basically possess numerous physical features which are in fact significantly common. Now, species are in fact capable of interbreeding and of course will in fact produce viable offsprings. Now, folks, let us evaluate this again. Would you be able to see a rat mating with a T-Rex? The answer would be definitely no. Would you see a mosquito mating with a lionfish, falling in love with a lionfish? The answer will be definitely no. All right, they are not compatible, folks. Now, many species, all right, the definition of species mean that the organisms can interrelate, all right, and interbreed, of course, and produce viable offsprings. But class, there is something I want to bear in mind. There is a little spook as it relates to this particular definition. Now, they say that species produce viable offsprings. Yes, right? We understand that, according to the definition. But there are, in fact, certain exceptions. Some organisms can, in fact, be very similar, right, in physical aspects. They may be different species, but they produce offsprings. Unfortunately, many of these offsprings cannot procreate. For example, a donkey mating with a horse will produce a mule. Mules cannot procreate. A lion mating with a tigress will create what you call a liger, which is a very large cat. This is often associated with these organisms if they are in captivity. This does not necessarily occur in the wild, right? But ligers are huge. All right, they are enormous, but they cannot procreate. We have seen also, according to National Geographic, where the grizzly bears are in fact mating with the polar bears. Now, we know for sure the polar bears are losing territory because of ice caps melting and stuff like that. Now, the grizzly bears are in fact mating with the polar bears to produce quote unquote pizzlies. Right? We will obviously see differences in the physical characteristics as well. They will look differently. Now, we can also see the blue whales mating with the Finland whales. Blue whales are in fact the largest organisms that scientists believe to have ever lived. All right, averaging at an estimated 100 meters in length. All right, their numbers are very poor. All right, very, very poor. Much lower than 300, according to the last statistics I saw. The fact of the matter, they can actually find their mates. It is very challenging. So they will have to simply depend upon other organisms, such as, well, other whales specifically, those which are similar to, to their sizes, such as the Finland whale, which can reach lengths of an estimated 80 feet. All right. Now, this is in fact very important. Now, personally, I have seen sheep mate with goat already. All right, because for instance, my dad had animals and he had sheep. he also had goats. And a female goat by the name of Mary, right, when I was small, I remember the name, she mated with a sheep called King Kong. Perhaps because of pheromones, they were able to communicate and stuff like that. And he broke away and he mated with the female goat. What happened is that his stomach was getting very, very large very quickly, and unfortunately, he accidentally he damaged her. Right within the coming weeks after, and she had to cast out the young. Otherwise, I believe she would have died. So, offspring may not necessarily be able to procreate in that regard. All right, so let's take that in consideration. Also, in some instances, we can actually see goats, all right, going into the forest, especially in eastern part of Trinidad, moving into the forest, and they cannot simply meet with existing deer populations. Now, folks, all of them that I mentioned just now, that is the concept of hybridization, where a new organism is created, all right, a new offspring is created, which is combination of two different species which are relatively close in their characteristics. The concept of hybridization here can actually be one of the plausible explanations why many existing species can potentially become endangered. All right. In addition to which, an organism or a species which is said to be endangered is in fact one which is relatively rare or perhaps threatened to a large extent, and their numbers are, of course, diminishing or perhaps have reached critical levels. All right. Another reason for species becoming endangered is due to habitat fragmentation, because human expansion is contributing to the organisms to retreat to relatively small parcels or small areas, and by extension, our level of development can be very invasive. In addition to this, another factor can also be human exploitation, where certain organisms can be hunted, they can be killed for their specific components. For example, with their meat, they can in fact be exploited for their hides, or perhaps in some instances their bones, all right, ivory and stuff like that. All right, so let's take that into consideration. So, folks, I hope this video was actually beneficial. All right, this is in fact, we will stop here for today. Now, next week, we'll continue from populations and further. Now, I will stop here for today because this is basically the first class. As time progresses, we will simply be talking more, all right, of these particular definitions. Any questions, feel free to email or perhaps message. That's not a problem at all. And with each particular week, we'll simply highlight some of the content for this particular unit as well as this particular module. All right, you all have a good one. Keep safe. Bye bye.